So I have taken a topic on demonification of the Yaksha in South Asian art. So before I proceed, let me make some clarification because Yaksha word which I have used in my presentation, there are some synonyms or there are some parallel words, and for the sake of clarity and just for being plain lazy, I'm not using the term Yaksha, Yakshi separate. So other than specifically, I may use the term Yakshani, but in general, if I'm talking about iconography, when I say Yaksha, I mean both Yaksha and Yakshani incorporated in my talk. So with that small clarification, I will move ahead with my presentation. So the Yaksha tradition is seen across the South and Southeast Asian regions in context with Buddhist as well as the native religious belief systems. And the paper discusses changing perspectives in which the Yaksha tradition has been depicted in the South Asian art and architecture, starting as indigenous spiritual deities visible throughout earlier cultural spaces, intermixing with classical religious traditions, and then literally sidelined as guardians or malevolent forms mixed with the folk traditions. So if we see this last sentence, uh, Dr. Kumaraswamy and Dr. Sutherland have done great work on Yaksha traditions in early 20th century. And both of the scholars, they have done monumental writings on the Yaksha tradition and Yaksha cult in Asia and Southeast Asia. So when I was going through their text, and because we are talking about nearly, especially in case of Kumaraswamy's writing, it is a writing done around 100 years ago when he wrote about a book on Yaksha. And in that context, he has used several terms to explain what does he mean by Yaksha, so that I will be discussing, and how during that time also when Kumaraswamy was discussing the concept of Yaksha, he was talking about how Yakshas were probably the indigenous spiritual deities or spiritual forms who were worshipped by the population, and slowly with the growth and development of more classical powerful state supported religions, these deities got merged with the traditional and classical religions, and they are adapted within those iconographical traditions later, but slowly they are pushed away, and instead of being the focus of iconography, they became more like the decorative elements or door guardians, and in later period they turned into a completely different spiritual forms where they were associated with a lot of negativity. And in present folk traditions, the similar idea of negative spiritual powers has continued till date. With that introduction, let me continue. So, as I said, the definition of the word yaksha itself, as we know that sometimes when we try to translate, we may struggle with the actual word meaning. So, Wilson, H.S. Wilson, when he did a translation of the famous literary work that is Kalidasa's Meghadutam or the Cloud Messenger, in the beginning or the foreword of his work, he tries to explain what does he mean by yaksha. So he introduces the protagonist of this poem as a divinity of an inferior order, an attendant upon the god of riches Kuvera, and one of a class which, as it appears from the poem, that is Megdutam, is characterized by a benevolent spirit, a gentle temper, and an affectionate disposition. And according to Kumaraswamy, as I quote, in ancient India, yakshas and yakshis, like other personal divinities, have usually been human beings and will be born as human beings, but as a class possessing the condition of yakshatva, yakshahood, and are local tutelary deities, nature spirits, and guardian angels or araka devatas. And the term yaksha was originally honorific. The chief of yakshas is Kubera, the regent or the god of north. It is, however, more particularly with yakshas and yakshas as natural spirits and spiritual spirits. Now, if you see the definition of Kumar Swami, he has incorporated almost every domain in which yaksha can be defined. It can be a spirit, it can be a tutelary deity, it can be a human being who belongs to a class of groups which is identified as yaksha. He also says that yaksha is probably a title or an honorific title. So if we see these definitions, we will find out that even after the complete definition, we cannot actually pinpoint that what basically yaksha meant in the literature as a individual group of either deities or subsidiary deities or some kind of guardian deities. So the methodology of the present paper is based on the field survey, which I had chance to visit during different times in last 4 5 years, analysis of available relevant literary and material data. And in this presentation, whatever images and plans which I have used, other than except mentioned in the PPT, all of them have been taken personally by me. The objectives of this paper is to understand the adaptation of the yaksha imagery and traditions by the local populace across South Asia, to observe the connotations associated with the yakshas indicative of their benevolent and malevolent behaviors depicted through iconography and folk traditions, to highlight the nature and significance of the devolution in the yaksha iconography in terms of socio-cultural frictions between indigenous regional belief systems and dominant state religions. Now I will, and I think most of the participants and most of the delegates listening to my presentation today, most of you are already familiar with the images which I will be showing, because these images are like the groundwork of iconography, especially in Indian context. So the earliest examples when we see start reflecting this physical form or material form of yaksha tradition from the early period, that is from 3rd century BC, around Mauryan period in India. And on the screen you're seeing is the famous sculpture of the Didarganj Yakshini, or the Chauri bearer female image. And it is one of the classic examples of one of the best examples of 3rd century BC sculpture forms of sandstone bearing the characteristic feature of highly polished surface associated with the royal art tradition from Mauryan period. And the identification of this sculpture as Yakshini has been under discussion since its discovery. Many scholars either call it directly as Yakshini and associate her gentle features and her beauty in relation with a spiritual deity, whereas some people have questioned this identity and they just try to identify it as a female guardian, female doorkeeper, or a chauri bearer, as she holds a chauri in her hand. So I will not go into that discussion or controversy about the identity of this particular image. And for the sake of my presentation, I will stick to its identity as Yakshmi. Then another similar forms of yaksha images which we have, which is presently in Indian Museum, Kolkata. Both all these images, including Didar Yakshini, they all are life-size scale images. And as in contrast to the Darganj Yakshini image, these two yakshas bear small labeled inscriptions in the bottom or the pedestal of these sculptures in Brahmi, which is dated based on paragraphy around 2nd century CE, probably Kushana or early Kushana period. And it gives the name of this sculpture, that is, one is called as Yakhe Achu Satigika, another one is called as Yakhe Sanat Nanda. So Yakhe as Yaksha, it comes here in Pali language. And it is an interesting thing because, as Kumar Swami earlier indicated, that Yaksha is like a title. So whether these two personalities who are identified by their personal names, it is one of the earliest examples which we come across where the Yaksha's names have been described with them. Similar traditions we see again in Bharat also. So now coming to the Yaksha imagery which we have come across in Bharat. So at Bharat, Yakshas or Yakshni appear at the Vedika part or at the Ushnisha part in different forms, either in the complete form or just the face part will be visible, and usually as some kind of decorative motif, riding a horse, simply standing, supporting themselves uh, with, with the help of a tree. That is the famous imagery of Shalabhanchika. I'm not going into detail in Shalabhanchika mode. Dr. Devangna Desai has done great work on that particular theme. So these are some of the such select images which I have just taken. Bharat is a very popular site. A lot of images are available. And here we have two examples of Yakshis represented. So here you have in first left-hand side image, smaller form, which is almost 1 feet in height, where you have the Shalabhanjika mode, where the Yakshini or female figurines are represented there with their left feet uh, across the tree and holding the tree as it is support. This is a very interesting and popular iconography which was used across Sachi and Bharut Vedika panels as part of decoration. The similar one in a much larger scale that is almost 7 feet high can be seen in the another Vedika part of the Bharut Stupa. Now in this context, the image of the Yakshini has moved from the Vedika part, but now as a bracket figure on the Torana of the Sachi Stupa, where you can see a voluminous female figure hanging and supporting herself from a shala tree. And the similar iconography or similar thought is represented in the right hand side image from Bharhut. Only difference which we have here is the material which was used for the stone and the material and how the artist has depicted these concepts. The idea remains the same. Only thing is the depiction has a little bit renovations used by the artist itself. Now we see all these examples which we have seen, the representation of Yaksha and Yakshinis were in large scale or life-size scale. But later period, around 4th, 5th century onwards, we start observing a trend in which the sizes of these sculptures started to get diminished in size. So the large stone yakshas and the profusion of smaller stone and terracotta yaksha and yakshis indicate the importance of the yaksha cult, which was existing in public as well as domestic domain. And around 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC, we see these examples in a bigger scale. But later, in the end of that millennium, small statues, especially from the tradition of Mathura School of Art and later same visible in Sarnath School of Art, the Yaksha and Yakshini image start to become smaller. And it shows, probably it indicates that now they were losing their importance in visibility in art forms, especially from religious context, and they were being sidelined by more important gods who were coming into picture. So some of the examples, we have different Yaksha and Yakshini images from different museums, which I had chance to visit. Now, this is one image of Hariti. So Hariti, as everybody is familiar, she is a goddess, mother goddess related to Buddhism. But in Buddhist tradition, when we look at the origin of Hariti, I'm not going much in detail because everybody is familiar that Hariti is associated with Jambhala, and she starts in Buddhist tradition as a malevolent spirit who used to hurt infants and babies, and later because of the divination of Lord Buddha and interference of Lord Buddha, she changed her attitude and she changes from a malevolent spirit to a mother figure for the children. And that image of Hariti holding a baby in her lap becomes a common Buddhist iconography starting from the 6th, 7th century AD and becomes popularized through the Pala school of art. So this particular example is from the Buddhist site of Bojanakonda in modern day Vizag district of Andhra Pradesh, where you can clearly see the almost life-size scale image of Hariti holding a little baby in her lap. And the presence of another actually images, especially in association with trees, animals, chaityas, or small stupas or pillars, they continue to be in all the Buddhist sites across India. So this particular example is from Koshambi, presently at Lucknow State Archaeology Museum. Now we were talking about Buddhism, but the similar tradition continues in Jainism also. And Professor M.N.P. Tiwari, he has extensively worked on Jaina iconography, especially his book is on elements of Jaina iconography, where he has discussed about the development of Jaina pantheon. So here in his work, he specifically mentions that how the Jaina pantheon divides its gods in different groups, and in that group of four, that is Bhavanavasi, Vayantara, Jyotishaka, and Vaimanaka. So in the second one, that is the Vayantara gods, in that Yakshas are included. And if you look at this description, there are six so-called Vyantara god classes: Yakshas, Bhutas, Pishacha, Rakshasa, Kinnara, and Gandharva. But when we look into the Jaina iconography, we will see that these Yakshas, both in Shvetambara and Digambara tradition, with some minor changes, they appear as so-called Shashna Devatas, or as the guardians of the main Tirthankara, represented on the pedestal or on the Prabhavali of these Jain Tirthankaras on either sides flanking the main figure. So I have one small interesting example in which the Jaina Yaksha are represented in individual forms also. This is example of Gomukha. Gomukha Yaksha associated with the first Tirthankara, that is Adinatha, and Yakshas appear in the Jaina iconography as guardians of the Tirthankaras as the Shashana Devatas. And this particular example is from Bhubaneswar around 7th century AD. Now moving to other countries outside India. So first example which I have taken is Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka, actually, if you look into the literary tradition coming from a Mahavansha context, Mahavansha talks about how Buddhism arrived in Sri Lanka. So there it mentions one of the first kings, the Chakravarti king of Sri Lanka, as Vijaya, King Vijaya, who came to India to colonize, who came to Sri Lanka with his followers. And when he landed in Sri Lanka, he had a chance to interact with the indigenous populations. And Mahavamsha divides this indigenous population into four groups. One is called as the Yakshas, Rakshasas, and Nagas. The fourth one is sometimes mentioned as Bhutas. Okay, so in this Yaka or Yakshas, the story goes on that Vijaya marries one of them, that is Kuveli, who is one of the leaders of the Yakshas, and she helps him in establishing his power. He founded the first capital, that is Anuradhapura, and afterwards, his population or his people start to protest against the dominance of Yaksha cult, Yaksha people within that. So there is some kind of friction happens, and the Yakshas and humans separate, and the story goes on like that. But the idea here is the Yakshas are indicated as human population, but not as spirits who helped the king, that is Vijaya, to settle down in that country. Okay, so the same idea continues in later period. Also in Mahayana Buddhism, Jambhala, who is shown in the screen right now, is a god of riches and the guardian of the northern direction, and his Buddhist equivalent of Kuvera. And Jambhala serves as the chief of Yaksha. His secondary role as a directional guardian was probably assumed later because of the Hindu influence coming into this country. Other examples which I have shown here is how the Yakshas now start to have a secondary position next to the Nagas, another group of deities, subsidiary deities who exist in the religious pantheon across Southeast Asia. So here we have a monastery. It is this particular image is from Anuradhapura site. There we have a basement of a monastery is here, and the steps have small decorative motifs, which shows the yakshas holding the weight of the structure as a load-bearing figure, something which we see in India, also in Badami, in Ellora, in Ajanta, where they appear in the bottom of the pedestal or the molding or adhisthana part of the structures as a load-bearing figures. So here we can see that how the Nagas have become more prominent in iconography. They appear as door guardians or on the balustrades of these steps, whereas the yakshas have been just sidelined as small decorative motifs, along with the other traditional forms like the Chandrashila or the moonstone. Similar design we also have from another Buddhist site, that is Polindurva from Sri Lanka, where the similar idea of this yakshas are represented as load-bearing figures across the steps, whereas the nagas are presented in a more dominant iconographical format in the form of door guardians. And now moving to the country, that is Thailand. In Thailand, the presence of Buddhism uh, happened across around probably 2nd century AD onwards, when Buddhism moved to this region from India across Burma. And in this particular example, we have the idea of same problem which we have just seen in Sri Lanka, where the correlation of these subsidiaries, that is yakshas and nagas, are coexisting. So in this particular example, I have given the reference for this particular image from Met Museum website. And here, the yaksha is actually supporting a large naga over his head. So again, it shows that how the naga cult was slowly diminishing or pushing away or dominating the yaksha tradition. Now, this is more recent examples. These are examples from the Royal Palace in Bangkok, Thailand, built around 18th century AD. And here we have the images of yakshas as doorkeepers of colossal size, nearly 8 feet in height. But again, the idea of yakshas as load bearing, we can see in one of the sites, that is the Arun Wat temple, which is in Bangkok. Here we have this temple. So in the temple, the lower part of the structure, which is like a tower kind of structure, here you can see a series of yakshas kneeling on one of their knees and supporting the weight of the upper part. So here another example is there. This is basically from same temple which I have shown earlier, that is Wat Arun. Wat means temple. And in this place, you can see two giant figures, two yakas, who are identified as characters from the Ramkin. Ramkin is the Thai version of Ramayana. And in Ramkin, yakas are represented. And the white color figure, the white color figure is called as Sahasadeja, and this greenish color one is called as Thotsakan. And Thotsakan is the equivalent of Ravana in a Ramayana story. But here, both of these yakas appear as the door guardians of the main temple. This is the main temple, and they are standing outside. Now, looking at one of the last examples, that is Vietnamese tradition. And in Vietnam also, yakshas appear in the tradition of what we see in India also, around 8th, 9th century AD's iconography of yakshas are repeated in Vietnam in the form of simple male figures seated in sometimes awkward position. And here in the first left-hand side image, this yaksha sculpture marks the first phase of Indic sculpture production in central Vietnam, and stylistic hallmarks, robust figure, fleshy face, wig-like hair, elliptical earplugs. They point to the artist's familiarity with how the Guptas were showing in the Sarnath School of Art different images. and models for such transmission remains unknown. How these formats entered Vietnam through which mode, that is not clear. And this particular sculpture was excavated from the site of Hoi An. Okay. So another sculpture we have is small picture which has been identified probably as the image of Kubera. When we look at our neighboring country, Nepal also has a very clear-cut influence of Yaksha tradition coming from Buddhism as well as Hindu tantric religion also. And there we have these two examples which I have taken, both from Kathmandu Valley, and they represent again the male yakshas represented in, uh, as I said, awkward position in the panels, stone panels, with uh, bent bodies and contrude bodies. So here you have both are from Kathmandu Valley side, and here you see a bearded. Both images show bearded faces and interesting hair coiffure, big ears, big eyes, protruding eyes, and just looking at the audience and having a kind of benevolent face. So this is my presentation about the Yaksha tradition, and now I stop here. Thank you, ma'am.